At 5:45 a.m. on June 6, Gefreiter Gerrit Hinrich so peered through the embrasure of his machine gun post at strongpoint WN62, overlooking what would soon be called Omaha Beach. He was a 20-year-old farm boy who had never even seen the ocean before being stationed in Normandy. On this morning, he saw no ocean at all, only steel. Ships everywhere. He would later write in his memoir. Big ships, small ships, fat ships with flat bottoms, destroyers racing back and forth like sheepdogs. The sheer mass of vessels was incomprehensible. The most chilling detail was the simplest. The horizon, that fundamental line separating sea and sky, was gone. It had been completely erased by an endless wall of approaching ships. I tried to count, so wrote, but gave up at 100. There were thousands. While the common soldier grappled with the sheer spectacle, the German officers began a terrifyingly sober calculation. At 5 a.m. at the Crisbeck battery, the binoculars of Oberleutnant zur See Walter Ohmsen swept across a sight that contradicted every assurance from the high command. The English Channel had transformed into a steel highway, an endless armada whose silhouettes merged into one continuous mass. Ohmsen was a 32-year-old naval officer, and what he saw through his Zeiss rangefinder was not just a fleet. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial capacity Nazi propaganda had assured him could not exist. The approaching force comprised 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, and over 1,600 support vessels. This was not a battle to be won with courage or tactics. For the first German defender to sight and engage the invasion of Fortress Europe, the mathematics of defeat were sailing toward him at 8 knots. This dawning catastrophe was met with a leadership vacuum. At Army Group B headquarters, 50 miles from the coast, Lieutenant General Hans Spittel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, monitored increasingly disturbing reports. But Rommel himself was absent, away in Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. He was utterly convinced that the poor weather made any invasion attempt impossible. This belief in the storm's protection created a fatal complacency throughout the high command. As Spittel watched the chaos unfold from a distance, the first reports of the invasion arrived at 1:20 a.m. The 7th Army was notified of massive parachute drops across Normandy, as over 13,000 men from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were delivered by C-47 Skytrans. While veteran commanders on the ground understood the immediate gravity of the situation, the highest levels of command were either absent or acting on the flawed assumption that they were safe, for now. At 5:30 a.m., the German defenders' first lesson in American industrial mathematics began. The Allied fleet, comprising 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 65 destroyers, commenced its bombardment. The violence of the shelling was on a scale the Wehrmacht had never encountered. In the first hour alone, the battleship USS Texas fired 255 rounds from its 14-inch guns. Each shell weighed 1,400 pounds, meaning a single ship delivered 178 tons of high explosives in just 60 minutes, more than what many German artillery regiments possessed in their total ammunition reserves. Before the first Allied soldier set foot on the beaches, the naval forces had fired approximately 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships. It was a pulverizing force that led General Gunther Blumentritt, a German chief of staff, to later testify, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. We found ourselves fighting factories." At 6 a.m., as the naval shells continued to pulverize the Atlantic Wall, a second wave of industrial superiority appeared in the sky. Thousands of Allied aircraft filled the air, a force so vast it seemed to blot out the sun. Allied air forces had already secured air supremacy before the invasion, and on D-Day they flew over 14,000 sorties in support of the landings. The Luftwaffe, with approximately 300 operational aircraft in all of France, managed only 319 sorties in response. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft, a mathematical absurdity. This complete impotence was perfectly symbolized by the famous actions of Major Joseph "Pips" Priller. Leading the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning, he and his wingman, Heinz Wudersick, strafe-soared beach once before fleeing from dozens of Allied fighters. This single, fleeting pass by 2 planes was the sum of the German aerial response against the might of the Allied air forces. Despite the overwhelming firepower, German defenders at certain positions initially believed they might hold. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division occupied excellent defensive positions on bluffs, creating interlocking fields of fire. As the first waves of American infantry hit the beach at 6:30 a.m., They walked into a slaughter. Machine gunner Hinrich so watched American soldiers fall by the hundreds as the beach turned red with blood. For a brief, desperate moment, it seemed the Atlantic wall might hold. Then the destroyers came. At approximately 8 a.m., with the situation critical, American destroyers ignored the risk of mines and grounding, closing to within 1,000 yards of the beach, point-blank range for naval guns. Ships like the USS McCook and USS Carmack turned their 5-inch guns on individual German strongpoints, and at such close range they couldn't miss. This action proved decisive for the German officers. This was a stunning realization. The Americans were willing to risk high-value warships as expendable assets, a mindset born of an industrial depth that could simply replace any losses. The destroyer USS Corey was lost, but others immediately took its place. As the morning progressed, German observers witnessed something that defied their understanding of amphibious operations, an endless conveyor belt of men and material flowing from sea to shore. The sheer variety of specialized vessels stunned them. Massive landing ship tanks, or LSTs, vessels 328 feet long, beached themselves and opened vast bow doors to discharge entire tank companies directly onto the shore. DUKW amphibious trucks swam to land, drove up the beach, and delivered supplies directly to the combat units fighting inland. Wave after wave, hour after hour, the landing craft kept coming in a continuous, unstoppable stream. By nightfall, this industrial-scale logistical operation had landed approximately 156,000 troops on French soil. In a single day, the Allies had landed a force that exceeded the entire German 7th Army defending Normandy. On June 7, German reconnaissance aircraft brought back photographs that senior officers initially refused to believe. The images showed the Allies doing something that challenged comprehension. They were not capturing ports, but building their own harbors from scratch in the open sea. These mulberry harbors represented an industrial and engineering capability on a scale the Germans could barely imagine. Prefabricated in Britain, the artificial ports consisted of 600,000 tons of concrete, 33 jetties, and 10 miles of floating roadways. The Germans had spent 4 years constructing the Atlantic Wall, a defensive system built on the assumption that the Allies needed to capture a major port. In a single stroke of engineering genius, the Allies had simply eliminated that requirement entirely, rendering years of German strategic planning obsolete. It was a profound intellectual shock, proving that the Allies were not just outproducing the Germans, they were outthinking them on a level they hadn't even considered. Throughout June, German commanders began to realize the full extent of their intelligence failure. The physical invasion had been preceded by a brilliant strategic deception, Operation Fortitude. This elaborate plan convinced German intelligence that the Normandy landings were merely a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw forces away from the true target.
The Germans were led to believe the real invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, spearheaded by the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, a phantom army supposedly under the command of General George Patton. The deception was so effective that for crucial weeks after D-Day, elite German panzer reserves remained frozen, held back to defend against a ghost army that would never come. It was a complete strategic humiliation. The German military was not just being outproduced and outfought, it was being comprehensively outwitted, paralyzed by an enemy that had defeated them mentally before ever firing a shot. As the physical front collapsed, the psychological front among the German high command shattered completely. In a frantic phone call from Berlin, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel demanded to know why the invasion hadn't been defeated. He asked the Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, what should be done. Von Rundstedt's famously blunt reply was a testament to the absolute hopelessness of the situation. Make peace, you fools. What else can you do? He was immediately relieved of command for this honesty. On June 17, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel met with Hitler and presented the stark, unvarnished statistics of the defeat, complete Allied air supremacy, German divisions at 30% strength, and the impossibility of any daylight movement. Hitler's response was to forbid any retreat, demanding only fanatical resistance. Rommel left the meeting knowing with absolute certainty that Germany was doomed. Within a month, he would be implicated in the plot to kill Hitler and forced to commit suicide. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy beginning July 25, provided the final, apocalyptic demonstration of Allied supremacy. The assault began with a preparatory carpet bombing attack of unimaginable intensity. A force of 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped 3,300 tons of bombs in a concentrated area just 6,000 by 2,200 yards. Positioned directly under this bombardment was the elite Panzer Lehr Division. The unit, which had entered Normandy with 190 tanks and 16,000 men, was simply erased from existence. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, sent a chilling report from the Inferno: "My division has been annihilated. We are not fighting an army. We are fighting an industrial complex." Of the 3,000 men in the targeted area, 1,000 died instantly, while another 1,000 were too psychologically shattered to continue fighting. Even a tragic friendly fire incident that killed 111 American soldiers, including a high-ranking general, was absorbed without affecting the operation's ultimate success.
The Falaise Pocket, which raged from August 12 to the 21st, became the final graveyard for German forces in Normandy. The statistics of the encirclement were apocalyptic. Between 10,000 and 15,000 German soldiers were killed, and another 40,000 to 50,000 were captured. The material losses were just as staggering. In the northern sector alone, 344 tanks and self-propelled guns were destroyed, along with 2,447 soft-skin vehicles, and 252 artillery pieces. While between 20,000 and 50,000 men managed to escape, they did so as disorganized remnants, not as effective fighting units. The German 7th Army had been comprehensively destroyed, its equipment left as a tangled wreck on the roads of Normandy. The German General Staff struggled to comprehend that they were not fighting a military campaign, but an industrial equation. The production comparisons for 1944 starkly illustrated the unwinnable war Germany was waging. That year, German factories produced 39,807 aircraft and 68,000 military trucks. In that same period, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft and 650,000 military trucks. These numbers didn't even include British, Canadian, or Soviet production. Germany was fighting the entire world's industrial output. The total scale of American wartime production was simply astronomical: 297,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2 million army trucks. After the war, General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, calculated that by 1944, the overall Allied advantage in war production was approximately 5-1, and in crucial categories like trucks, it was 10-1. His final analysis was chilling. "We were not defeated," he concluded. "We were mathematically eliminated." The German officers who survived Normandy were psychologically transformed. They had witnessed not just a military defeat, but the complete invalidation of the Nazi ideology that had shaped their worldview. Young officers, in particular, who had grown up under Nazism, were deeply affected. They had been indoctrinated with propaganda telling them that Americans were soft, spoiled by luxury, and unable to fight. Instead, they discovered an enemy that used machines to do the hard work, radios to coordinate with precision, and had the confidence that came from unlimited logistical support. This brutal confrontation with reality was more than just a loss on the battlefield. It was the shattering of their entire belief system. Defeat was one thing, but the complete invalidation of their worldview was another. For many, this intellectual and emotional collapse was too much to bear, leading to a dramatic spike in the suicide rate among German officers. In 1954, 10 years after D-Day, surviving German officers gathered in Bonn for a private symposium on the Normandy campaign. The keynote address was delivered by General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who had served as chief of staff to both Rundstedt and Kluge. His address served as the final, considered verdict from the men who had been defeated. "We learned in Normandy that war had changed fundamentally," he stated. "It was no longer a contest of armies but of economic systems. We counted divisions while they counted factories. We measured courage while they measured production." He concluded with a haunting image that perfectly encapsulated the industrial mismatch. "The image that haunts me still is the sight of American bulldozers pushing aside our destroyed tanks to clear roads for their supply trucks." For the survivors, the lesson was clear. They had brought soldiers to a fight that would be won by engineers and assembly lines. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, the story came full circle. Walter Ohmsen, the former Oberleutnant zur See, now 73 years old, returned to the Crisbeck battery as an honored guest. He stood at the same reinforced concrete observation post where he had first sighted the impossible Armada 4 decades earlier. Speaking to a gathered crowd of veterans from both sides, he reflected on the moment that had changed his life. 40 years ago, I stood here and saw the impossible. I knew in that moment that everything I had been told was wrong. Weak nations don't build 7,000 ships. Divided nations don't coordinate such an invasion. He recalled the actions of his gun crews, who had fought bravely and managed to sink one American destroyer. "I fired my guns at that Armada," he said, "and I might as well have been throwing stones at the tide." His words provided the ultimate emotional catharsis, the personal testimony of the first man to witness the end of an era.